Hey kid, come here a sec.
You want to buy some lore?
What's good, Vam? You already know the drill. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into the iceberg. Thanks to y'all over on Patreon, the vote for the next casual iceberg video was to simply continue casually breaking down more and more of Tier 1. So I'm over here looking at Tier 1, right? You can see it right there, and I'm like updating it, and I'm looking at it trying to figure out which entry we want to talk about first. And then I look down here and I'm like, oh, hey, there it is, we got it. It's the first city. The city of Enoch, and the subsequent flood that follows it. Thought we were done with the Book of Nod, but not yet. We have just a little bit more to talk about. Anyway, I thank you ahead of time for joining me. Let's talk a little bit about the first city of Enoch. So, the first city is, simply put, the city that Cain ruled over after becoming a vampire. The place where most, if not all, of the antediluvians of the third generation were created, just after the creation of Enoch, Irad, and Zillah of the second generation. What is known of the first city prior to the deluge? Y'all don't know this, I'm leaving this in the video. I'm with the Discord degenerates that joined this fucking server and they're making me laugh. What is known of the first city prior to the deluge, according to everybody's favorite, the Book of Nod, as it were, comes from a collection of 2,000-plus-year-old fragments of tablets and carved monuments from an undisclosed location, probably from parts of the Middle East, like where Sumer and the like were. A little side note, by the way, the oldest Book of Nod fragment found within this collection I mean, is dated to be roughly from 4500 BC, around the location of Sumer. Anyway, as you can imagine, the first city was a place particularly created to house the most ancient and legendary vampires like Enoch, Irad, and Zillah. And of course, Cain himself. It was a society built around their needs, their customs, and their powers. Cain ruled at the top of the hierarchy, with Enoch, Irad, and Zillah second to his word. Then of course the rest of the third generation antediluvians held third in this rung or status. That being said, one of these third generation antediluvians named Shoutout is always described as having been just about always seen at Cain's side. I'm not sure Shoutout is anybody important though. To nobody's surprise, the children of Seth themselves, aka humans, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. All humans, except for one, known as the Master of Servants, or the One Who Serves. This wasn't actually a title, this is an individual man. Many of fragments which refer to him as Jabal. Jabaldi's nuts. Apparently Jabal was a valuable enough human to Cain that he actually held the power equivalent to the third generation antediluvians. Simply put, he was an equal to the antediluvians themselves. That being said, Jabal was not totally human though, as it is described in some of the fragments that just about all of the blood circulating through Jabal's body was actually Cain's own blood. What I'm getting at here is Jabal may have been the first ghoul to have ever existed, leaving room for all sorts of wild speculation. Some believe Jabal was actually Seth, Cain's last remaining brother. Others think that this is the actual Methuselah himself, the man named Methuselah, who appears in the book of Genesis as, if I recall correctly, the son of Enoch. The Genesis Enoch, I mean, which may or may not have been the same vampire named Enoch, but I digress. Other sources claim that Jabal is actually none other than Abel himself, who was granted new life after Cain became the first vampire. It's important to note that some of the third generation antediluvians themselves had the ability to, under very particular circumstances, return life to the dead. I'm not saying take the dead and make them undead, I'm saying take the dead and bring them back to life. So who knows what kind of power, potential that Cain himself has. We'll not dwell on that existentialistic nightmare too much of being the first ghoul to Cain. We got a first city to talk about. I'm gonna wait for these cops to pass by. There's always police sirens. So Cain is on top. Second generation are second to his command, third generation are third to his command alongside Jabal. The fourth in command were basically any ghouls of the second or third generation, and the final rung being the rest of the humans themselves. As for Cain, he is described as having deeply cared for the longevity of mortal kind, at least in a way that put mortals' value over other vampires. Like, sure, his vampiric offspring held rule, but Cain was an overseer, a protector, and a guiding hand to the mortals. In many of the fragments, he's depicted as a tiger or a wolf or a hawk that delivers swift and a final judgment. He's described as having sat upon an ivory throne, using his masterful level of vampiric disciplines like Auspex to simply look into the hearts of any who stood before him, to which he would be able to simply determine whether or not their heart was in the right place. He could also tell if any of the vampires or mortals that stood before him were being manipulated by other vampiric disciplines, to which he could simply render all of these disciplines away, completely innate with a simple wave of the hand. Cain is also described as having to have straight up just invented disciplines on the spot. Thaumaturgy, like most blood magic, if you trace it all the way up to these fragments in particular, if you believe what the First City tells you, then indeed thaumaturgy and other forms of blood magic to, I don't know, give me a discipline. Cain created it, probably as needed. I'm not talking about the primary disciplines, but these more so clan-specific, unique types of disciplines. Despite all that we mentioned, though, men are still men, living are still living, and slavery was undoubtedly used within the First City. What's interesting to note about the slaves present, however, is all of them are depicted as being collarless and free, so they were most likely bent into submission with those vampiric disciplines like dominate. Or perhaps this is just a bias to show that, you know, our slaves are fine, don't worry about them. I can't help but imagine, by the way, just the thought of suddenly like gaining conscience and free will and realizing that you've been farming and toiling away for a bunch of immortal vampires, only to look to your right and see a giant wave being thrown at you by God himself, to which you, I guess, could take comfort knowing that that wave is there to save you after all. Let's move on to the topic of blood feeding within the First City, now that we're talking about mortals and the like. Remember the Sabbat? Well, if you recall, the Sabbat are known for, among thousands of other things, the act of the blood feast. You know, the ritual act of tying up mortal cattle and dining upon their corpses while they lie there helplessly, like Castle Volkahar from Skyrim or something like that. Well, the reason why they do this is actually because they do it in remembrance of Cain. You see, these fragments used to describe that Cain and his ilk would actually also perform the blood feast, quite often actually, though according to these fragments, unlike the Sabbat, who would tie up pretty much any old poor bastard, string them up and drink their blood, Cain would save this punishment as a sort of judgment for the guilty and the criminal, alongside also the worthy and the valuable, you know, those mortals who just happen to be born with very delicious, powerful blood. And all of these kindred, not just Cain, would partake of this great blood feast of judgment, so to speak. Cain may have exclusively fed on living blood in this manner. To make things even more interesting, according to some of these fragments, the First City had within it several blood cooks who would actually imbibe human blood with savory spices, herbs, and grant them and deliver them to Cain alongside food and drink. Cain also had his own way of tracking the seasons. He actually had his own form of rudimentary calendar. This calendar was created simply by Cain drawing a line of his own blood from the upper walls of his great palace from one side to the other. This line of blood would naturally travel from one point of the ceiling to the other, one side of the room to the other side of the room, completely in alignment with the sun and moon itself. So there you go, vampires invented the wheel and the calendar. So according to the known fragments, humans possessed a form of their own birth control, which was probably done by a vampire paranormally aborting the child, Shoutout San Francisco. The only reason why your fetus got aborted within the First City is because these vampires could paranormally discern whether or not your fetus would eventually fit the needs of the city. And the only reason why you would be eligible to have a child in the first place, not a vampiric child, I mean an actual baby, a human baby, is if you were essentially outstanding in your line of work, or if your blood is strong, or you display aptitude in farming or being a good warrior. All of these things may grant you eligibility to continue your bloodline. And the sex itself would happen within what the tomes and fragments referred to as the Temple of Lilith, which was neither a temple nor a place of Lilith worship. It was instead a great red and black building in which men and women would be yeeted into the temple by vampires, have ritual sex, be separated, and never see each other again. Vampires would then look upon the woman with their aspects, discern if she was with child, and then move on to the next ceremony. On the topic of religion and rituals, by the way, there was essentially no religious practice that was allowed within the city of Enoch. Cain entirely forbade worship to the one above, and there were no temples to wash oneself free of their sins. Some fragments tell of those nights when Cain himself would belittle his subjects, living or dead, as all doomed to rot away in hell, just like him. And as we now know, he was certainly not lying about that. A little bit more on the geography of the city itself, by the way. Most of what we know regarding the city's geography doesn't actually come from the Book of Nod, but instead the source book known simply as the Dirty Secrets of the Black Hand. And we're not going to get into it, but basically there exists a damn near one-to-one copy of the first city of Enoch that exists within the underworld or afterlife. Again, I'm being very general here. Which this reflection, this underworld copy of the first city, can be used at least partially to illustrate what the first city itself may have looked like during its possible existence within the world of the living. So, if we assume that the underworld reflection of the first city is actually a proper reflection, then the first city had all sorts of crazy features that existed alongside all the other ones that we mentioned. The city had within it incredible statues carved by one known as Arakel, the purported antediluvian of Clan Toreador. There also existed a grand and ancient library near the center of the first city, which was owned and created by the Bruja antediluvian, most likely Ilias, before Troil diablerized him. There also existed a great deal of beautiful hanging gardens established throughout the city, all maintained by Malkav of Clan Malkavian. The roads and the streets were created and maintained to absolute perfection by the antediluvian Ventru of Clan Ventru. Perfect would also be the word to describe Irad of the second generation and his great network of slave pits built by those he captured during his many conquests. There also existed a great number of catacombs in which the antediluvians would find their rest. The underworld reflection of the first city itself, interestingly enough, is sealed off, and none have actually ever stepped into these said catacombs, these crypts themselves. That being said, visions of those who stand and dream near the crypts have reason to believe that 4 antediluvians are sealed within the underworld reflection of the first city, all of which are known as the Aralu. But again, we're gonna save the whole Black Hand and underworld stuff for another time. There also existed a great pool, known simply as the Pool of Zilla, which was a great clear pool of not blood, but water, perfectly clean water, which was believed to have granted visions of the future and of prophecy to those who could discern the waters, the visions that those waters had to grant them. Certain portions of the city were reserved exclusively for mortal infants and children who had yet to reach adulthood. These children were completely prohibited from witnessing the rest of the first city until they came of age. Yet, among everything else I described, one major architectural feature stands out from all the others within the city of Enoch, and that would be Gemal, the Dread Palace, the home of Cain himself. Gemal is a palace described as lavish and decorated with only the finest of craftsmanship that you could get from across the entirety of the land, at least as far as Cain could reach. Lining the walls of the Dread Palace were great murals recreating and depicting the vast history of Cain and the first city itself. Exotic, lavish, and precious statues, medals, relics, and art made of gold and other valuable materials adorned the entirety of the palace itself. Gemal was the place in which the aforementioned blood feasting of judgment would occur, though criminals, as I mentioned, weren't the only people to be fed on. Those with a particular special and powerful blood would also be fed upon here within the same floor of the palace. The lowest level of the palace, which served as Irat's court, is a great meeting hall for all members of all sects of the blood to converse and hold forums among each other. It was also a museum and an armory for many exotic and archaic weapons, perhaps like the Sword of Troil, among many others. In the center of this chamber sat Cain's ivory throne as well. The second level of the palace was a place called the Hall of Havens, which could house hundreds of both living and dead, at least 200 in capacity. The third level of the palace was a place of exclusive ceremony, Elegant celebrations to orgies of pleasure would occur throughout the place, with even more havens suitable for the undead also present. The fourth level of the Dread Palace has been lost. The purpose of it, I mean, though it may have been Cain's personal quarters. The final, fifth level of the Dread Palace sits Cain's final throne, the throne of basalt, which he is believed to have sat upon during the time of judgment known as Gehenna. With all that in mind, the entirety of the city itself is described as, though entirely unique, ripe with architecture that is very similar to something like that seen within the era of Mesopotamia and the like, some 2,000 years ago. All that being said, it's still worth noting that most humans remained active in the daytime, with vampires ruling the night. As a result, the majority of the city existed primarily in darkness, though of course it's worth acknowledging that some of these vampires may or may not have been able to operate in the daytime. You know how it is. First, second, and third gen vampires may or may not have been able to withstand sunlight to a degree, be it through disciplines or otherwise, but that's neither here nor there. On the topic of antediluvians though, I'd actually like to look towards some of the rulebooks themselves to help visualize what these vampires may have operated like. Vampire the Masquerade V20 describes the second generation as simply impossibly powerful beings that are the true clan-founding antediluvians, not the third generation. The next one is gonna piss some of y'all off, so I'm gonna preface this by saying that for every L VTM 5th edition possesses, there also exists its Ws, especially on the mechanical side of things. So before y'all totally shit on me for addressing a V5W, hear me out for 2 seconds. So without getting too in depth, if we reference V5's blood potency mechanic, which is essentially a vampire's power level, an interesting picture gets painted. So to summarize, the higher a vampire's blood potency is, the worse their vampiric curse becomes. Vampire's generation determines the minimum and maximum blood potency they possess, which is rated on a scale of 0 to 10. An 8th generation vampire can have a minimum blood potency of 2 and a maximum of 6. And a blood potency of 2, by the way, is very powerful, though at the cost of, for example, animal and cold blood only being as half as powerful, half as capable of slaking your hunger than a lower blood potency vampire would have to deal with. A blood potency of 6, meanwhile, while terrifying as hell, is no longer able to receive any value from drinking animals or cold blood. Furthermore, they have to drink nearly twice as much human blood as a vampire of a more standard potency for the same slaked hunger value. Additionally, a blood potency vampire has to drain entire mortals to reduce their hunger after a certain point. So, what am I getting at? Well, check this out. Let's assume, just for fun, just assumptions, Cain, second, and third generation vampires are blood potency 10. So 17 vampires at blood potency 10. Each of these vampires have a hunger score from 0, empty, to full, 5. Draining a human to death, for most vampires, slakes 5 points of hunger. So draining a mortal to death brings most starving vampires to full. However, these 17 vampires, just for the sake of assumption, due to their blood potency of 10, slake 3 less per human drained. So in other words, these 17 vampires only regain 2 points of hunger per mortal they drink to death. Furthermore, if they want to decrease their hunger past 3, they have to drain mortals to death by way of feeding. So they can no longer get away with leaving you on death's door from lack of blood loss, which will probably kill you anyway, so why even waste the blood? Okay, so with all that in mind, 17 vampires. Each of them have to drain at least 3 mortals to get their hunger to maximum. That, or they have to gather the blood tithe equivalent of 1 full human being, drink it, and then have to kill someone anyway if they want to be even more full. Furthermore, let's assume, just assume, these vampires have to make the standard hunger rouse check per night in order to animate themselves or wake up. When this check is made, there is essentially a 50% chance that they either gain a point of hunger or not. So, assuming they make this roll each night they animate, it may increase their hunger or it may not. So with all that in mind, then let's do some college dropout math. Assuming that in a 365-day period, half of those days will gain the vampire a point of hunger to animate, 50%. We take that number, divide it by 2, representing the 2 points given from draining mortals to death, and then multiply that total by 17, just representing these 17 vampires alone. With all that in mind then, the final number comes out to 1,552 when rounded up. Assuming all of the aforementioned criteria, 1,552 humans, maybe more, maybe less, will die within a year span of existing in the first city. And that's before we even acknowledge the 7 billion caveats that shake up this number. For example, some of these antediluvians could survive simply off the breath and not the blood of the living. Others probably just remained asleep most of the time, only popping up in certain periods of time. And look, even if you want to say, well, hey, none of this blood potency crap applies to the first 3 generations, there were still 4th and 5th generations present that were bound by these penalties at some point. And some believe there were even more antediluvians, like hundreds more, and that the 13 that remain are just the ones that made it in the end. And look, I'm not trying to say this 1,500 number is, this is what the number actually looks like. I'm just trying to paint a picture so that we can perhaps better attempt to understand the gravity of just what we're dealing with when it comes to the first city, how it might have operated or what it might have looked like. If this 1,500 figure is even remotely true, then the first city was truly a vampiric empire, a place devoted to the blood. Anyway, perhaps mortals would toil away at their fields in the day, with crop and harvest blessed by vampiric blood, all to ultimately serve as cattle for the great empire of the undead.